The morning fog drifted low over the harbor, swallowing the outlines of ships and cranes until they appeared as gray silhouettes against the horizon. The scent of salt water hung heavy in the air, mixed with the faint tongue of oil and iron. At the far end of the pier, where the Navy destroyer USS Hayes prepared for her first ceremonial voyage, the base buzzed with quiet excitement. Officers in pressed uniforms hurried back and forth, clipboards in hand, ensuring every flag was properly hung and every hatch polished to a mirror shine. Through this ordered motion, an old man walked slowly, not with the brisk stride of a sailor, but with the steady, deliberate steps of someone who carried years in his bones. He wore a weathered Navy jacket that looked older than most of the recruits stationed there. Its fabric was frayed at the collar, the patches faded to near invisibility. A baseball cap shaded his eyes, though even from a distance, the posture said enough. Straight-backed, shoulders squared, the kind of stance drilled into a man by decades at sea. He stopped several times along the path, pausing to look out at the water as if it were an old friend. The young sailors who passed gave him puzzled glances, unsure whether to salute or simply move on. To them, he was just another aging veteran, one of many who came to watch a new ship set sail, perhaps reliving memories best left behind. But there was something different about this one. In his right hand, he clutched a small round object, an old Navy medal. The silver had tarnished over the years, but the engraving was still faintly visible. Valor Under Fire. 1954. His thumb moved over it absently, tracing the edges as if drawing courage from its cool surface. When he reached the security checkpoint at the pier's entrance, 2 young guards stepped forward. Both were polite, but firm. "Sir, this area is restricted to authorized personnel only," one of them said, lifting a hand to block his path. The old man looked up. His eyes were pale blue, the kind that once held command over men and storms alike, now softened by time. He smiled faintly. "I understand, son. I just wanted to take a look. That ship," he pointed toward the destroyer, gleaming through the fog. "She's something special." The guard followed his gaze, unsure how to respond. "She sure is, sir," he said cautiously. "But I'm afraid I can't let you through." "Not without clearance." The veteran nodded slowly, as though he'd expected that answer. He looked past the guard toward the ship again. His lips parted slightly, and for a brief moment, his composure wavered. "She reminds me of another," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "Same lines. Same steel bones. Different soul, though." The younger of the 2 guards, perhaps sensing a story behind those words, softened a little. "Were you Navy, sir?" The old man smiled again, a flicker of pride lighting his face. "A lifetime ago. Served 30 years. Captain of a destroyer once." "Really?" the guard said, eyes widening. "Which one?" The man's fingers closed around the metal, his expression distant. "The USS Valor." The guards exchanged looks. The name meant little to them. The ships of that era were history lessons, not living memories. But the older guard, who had an uncle that once served, recognized it immediately. "The Valor? Didn't she go down in the Pacific?" The veteran's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sea shimmered faintly through the morning haze. "She did," he said quietly, "in a storm that took more than a ship. It took brothers." Silence hung between them. The younger guard shifted uncomfortably, his sense of protocol clashing with something deeper respect. But before he could decide what to do, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Gentlemen, what's the hold-up here?" A young lieutenant approached, his uniform immaculate, his boots shining even in the mist. He couldn't have been older than 28. His face still held the arrogance of someone who'd never seen real fear. His nameplate read LT. "Carter." The guard straightened immediately. "Sir, This gentleman's attempting to access the pier without authorization. Lieutenant Carter's eyes flicked over the old man with a trace of impatience. Sir, I'm afraid this area is restricted. You'll need to step back. The old man nodded politely. I understand, son. I just wanted a closer look at her. That ship? What's her name? The USS Hayes? Carter said shortly. Now, if you'd please. The name hit him like a bolt of electricity. His hand trembled. Hayes? He repeated, almost whispering it. Yes, sir, Carter said, misunderstanding the reaction. Named after some war hero from the Korean era, I think. Captain William R. Hayes. Maybe you've heard of him? The old man's lips parted, but no sound came. The metal in his hand gleamed faintly as a ray of sunlight pierced through the clouds. I've heard of him, he finally said. More than most. Carter's expression hardened again. Sir, I understand your interest, but without clearance. Clearance, the veteran interrupted gently, the word tasting strange in his mouth. You think a man needs clearance to see his own name on a ship? The lieutenant blinked. Excuse me? The veteran met his gaze, and for the first time, the authority in his eyes returned, quiet, commanding, unshakable. I'm Captain William R. Hayes, he said softly, and I'd just like to see the ship they named after me. The dock went completely still. One of the guards looked at Carter, unsure what to do. The young officer's face flushed crimson. He opened his mouth, but words refused to come. It couldn't be. The record said Captain Hayes had been lost at sea decades ago. But the man standing before him was very much alive. Sir, Carter stammered, his training warring with disbelief. That's impossible. Captain Hayes was reported missing. The old man finished calmly. Not dead. There's a difference. He smiled faintly. The sea takes what it wants. Sometimes, though, it gives something back. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of engines and the soft lap of waves against the hulls. Carter swallowed hard, lowering his voice. Sir, if what you're saying is true, it's true enough, Hayes said, his gaze locked on the ship. And I won't cause trouble. Just let me stand here a moment. That's all I came for. The young officer hesitated. His instincts screamed to follow procedure, but something in the old man's eyes made him pause. There was no defiance there, only quiet yearning, the kind that could break even the sternest regulation. Finally, Carter nodded stiffly. 1 minute. But you stay behind the barrier, understood? Captain Hayes nodded. Aye, Lieutenant. He stepped forward to the edge of the pier, resting a trembling hand on the metal railing. The ship loomed ahead, a monument of steel and memory. The sight brought back a rush of faces, voices, laughter that once filled the decks of another ship long gone. His chest tightened, but not from age. From remembrance. Beautiful, he whispered, voice breaking. You carry good company, girl. Behind him, Carter watched in silence, an unexpected respect blooming inside him. He didn't know who this man truly was, but somehow, he knew he was standing in the presence of something rare, a piece of history still breathing. And as the first sunlight broke through the fog, glinting off the bow of the USS Hayes, the name carved into her steel seemed to glow, a name that had been thought lost to time, now standing once again at the edge of the sea. The story of the old captain had just begun to unfold. Lieutenant Carter stood stiffly beside the security post, his thoughts tangled between disbelief and duty. The name Captain William R. Hayes echoed in his mind like a drumbeat. The old man standing before him, thin, weathered, with trembling hands, couldn't possibly be the same man whose name was etched in gold across Navy history books. And yet, something about his presence made Carter hesitate. It wasn't arrogance or delusion. It was the quiet certainty in the man's voice, The kind that didn't need to convince anyone because it had once commanded hundreds. Still, protocol was protocol. "Sir?" Carter began carefully, his voice carrying both respect and unease. "I mean no disrespect, but that's a very serious claim. Captain Hayes was declared missing in action nearly 40 years ago. You'll understand why that's difficult to believe." The old man smiled faintly, looking toward the destroyer that bore his name. "Difficult, yes, but not impossible, Lieutenant. The sea has strange rules of its own." The younger officer folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "Even if what you're saying is true, sir, I can't just let anyone approach a classified vessel. There are security protocols." Hayes nodded, still calm. "I know. I wrote some of them." That answer caught Carter off guard. He stared at the man for a long moment, studying the lines on his face, the clarity in his gaze. It wasn't the look of someone lost in fantasy. It was the look of someone who'd seen too much and no longer needed to prove it. Still, the lieutenant felt the eyes of his subordinates watching him. The guards nearby stood uneasily, torn between obedience and curiosity. He couldn't afford to look weak. "Sir," Carter said again, more firmly now, "I'll need you to wait while I confirm your identity. Please don't make this difficult." Hayes chuckled softly, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement. "Son, if I wanted to make it difficult, I'd have brought my old command voice." That drew a small smile from one of the younger guards, quickly suppressed under Carter's glare. The old man continued, his tone softening. "I didn't come to cause trouble. I came because I heard about the ceremony. They named her USS Hayes, and I thought, well, maybe I should see her one last time before the tide takes me for good." Carter hesitated. The words held a weight that pressed against his chest. But he shook it off. "Be that as it may, sir, regulations." "Regulations?" Hayes interrupted gently, finishing the word for him. "Yes, I know them well. They keep men safe. Most of the time. But sometimes, son, they can keep a man from doing the right thing too." The lieutenant's composure wavered. He didn't know how to respond to that, how to argue with a man who spoke not from arrogance, but from a lifetime of experience. Still, he held his ground. "Sir, you'll need to step back until I receive confirmation from my superior." The veteran sighed and nodded. "Of course." He took a few slow steps backward and leaned lightly against the railing, eyes never leaving the destroyer. For a moment, there was silence, just the hum of engines and the faint calls of gulls circling overhead. Carter turned away and began to radio command, his voice professional but slightly tense. "This is Lieutenant Carter at Pier 4. We have a civilian here claiming to be retired, Captain William R. Hayes, the namesake of the destroyer, requesting immediate verification." Static filled the radio for a few seconds before a voice responded, puzzled. "Say again, Lieutenant? Did you say Captain Hayes?" "Yes, sir," Carter replied. "An elderly man. Claims to be the same Captain Hayes presumed missing in the Pacific, 1954. There was a long pause, then a skeptical laugh from the other end. "Lieutenant, that's impossible. Captain Hayes' body was never recovered. He'd be, 95 now? You sure this isn't some confused veteran?" Carter's eyes flicked toward the old man, who stood quietly, watching the ship with an expression so full of restrained emotion, it made the lieutenant's chest tighten. "I'm not sure of anything right now, sir," he admitted, "but there's something about him." "Copy that," the voice replied. "Stay put. We're sending someone down." Carter clipped the radio back to his belt, exhaling slowly. He glanced at the old man again. "They're sending someone," he said, his tone less sharp than before. Hayes nodded. "That's fair." "You know, sir," Carter said hesitantly, "if you really are who you say you are, you shouldn't be standing here alone." There'd be books, interviews, your names on a warship, for God's sake. Hayes smiled, the corners of his mouth barely lifting. That's exactly why I stayed away. The ocean doesn't give medals, Lieutenant. It takes men. Good men. I didn't want to be remembered for surviving them. The young officer said nothing. For a moment, the fog felt heavier. Nearby, a few sailors had gathered under the guise of duty, cleaning, adjusting lines, pretending to work while stealing glances at the scene. Whispers rippled quietly through them. Who's the old guy? They say he's the real Captain Hayes. Can't be. He went down with his ship. What if it is him? The murmur spread, a current of curiosity that reached the nearby deckhands preparing for the Admiral's arrival. Even the base photographer had stopped taking ceremonial photos to watch from a distance. Carter could feel it, the tension, the eyes, the silent challenge in the air. He straightened his uniform, unconsciously. Then, breaking the silence, Hayes spoke again. Tell me something, Lieutenant. Have you ever been in a storm at sea? Carter frowned. Not a real one, sir. Just training drills. Hayes nodded knowingly. Then you've never heard the sound a ship makes when she's fighting to stay alive. It's like she's breathing, groaning, begging you not to let her die. His voice grew distant, softer. We hit one in '54, middle of the Pacific. A typhoon. The Valor was an old girl. She held as long as she could. We saved most of the crew. But when I looked back, she was gone. He stared at the water again, his eyes unfocused. She went under quietly. Didn't scream, just slipped away like she'd had enough of war. Even Carter couldn't hide his fascination now. And you? How did you survive? Hayes smiled faintly. A piece of debris. 2 days adrift before a fishing boat found me. By the time I got home, they'd held the memorial. My name was carved in stone. I figured maybe that was the Navy's way of letting me rest. So I did. The lieutenant swallowed hard. The words sank deep, heavier than orders or regulations. A horn sounded in the distance, the Admiral's convoy approaching. The base suddenly came alive again, officers straightening, sailors lining up, boots clicking in unison. Carter snapped back into duty mode. Sir, you'll have to stay here until the Admiral arrives, he said quickly, though his voice lacked the firmness it had earlier. Hayes nodded. Of course. I'll wait. As the cars rolled closer, the crowd on the pier grew denser. The whispers returned, but this time they carried something different, a quiet reverence. The veteran adjusted his cap, straightened his jacket, and stood tall. Despite the years etched into his face, for a moment, he looked every bit the captain he once was, proud, composed, unshaken by authority. Lieutenant Carter, standing beside him, felt a strange mix of shame and awe. He wanted to apologize, yet didn't know how. Sir, he said finally, almost under his breath, if what you said is true, it's an honor. Hayes turned, his expression gentle. You've got good manners, son. The Navy will need more of that than it does rules. Before Carter could respond, the first car door opened, and the Admiral stepped out, medals gleaming, expression sharp. He was about to demand an explanation for the delay when his eyes caught sight of the old man at the barrier. The moment hung suspended in time. The Admiral froze, color draining from his face. His lips parted slightly as recognition flickered in his eyes. Good God, he whispered. It can't be. Lieutenant Carter looked between them, stunned. But deep down, he already knew. The impossible had just walked out of the fog. The pier fell quiet the moment the Admiral's gaze locked on the old man. The crisp morning wind that had been tugging at the flags seemed to still, as though the air itself recognized the weight of the moment. Sailors who had been joking seconds before stopped mid-sentence. The only sounds that remained were the distant calls of seagulls and the soft creak of ropes straining against steel cleats. Lieutenant Carter straightened instinctively as the Admiral approached. "Sir," he began, "we had a situation at the checkpoint." This man, but the Admiral didn't hear him. His eyes remained fixed on the veteran, his expression shifting from surprise to disbelief, and finally to something resembling reverence. "Captain," he breathed. "Captain William R. Hayes?" The old man looked up, squinting through the light. Recognition dawned slowly, but when it did, his lips curved into a faint smile. "You've grown up, son," he said. "Last time I saw you, you were barely out of the academy." The Admiral froze. His hand dropped from his cap. You remember me?" "Of course," Hayes replied softly. "You were Ensign Brooks. You froze up during that storm on the Valor. I told you to hold the line." "You did?" A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. The name USS Valor wasn't just any ship. It was legend among the old-timers. Every sailor had heard the story in some form or another. The destroyer caught in a monstrous typhoon, her captain refusing to abandon his men, steering her into the waves until she vanished beneath the sea. Captain William R. Hayes, declared missing, presumed dead. And now here he stood, alive. Admiral Brooks blinked hard, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought you were gone, sir. They said no one could have survived that storm." Hayes chuckled quietly. "The sea tried her best. I just wasn't ready to give her what she wanted." The Admiral stepped forward, extending a trembling hand. Then, in a rare break of military decorum, he snapped to attention and saluted sharply. Every man on the pier instinctively followed. Dozens of hands rose in unison, sailors, officers, mechanics, all saluting the man history had thought was lost. Hayes hesitated for a heartbeat before returning the salute, his old arm steady despite its years. The motion, slow and deliberate, carried the weight of forgotten battles and unspoken grief. Lieutenant Carter, standing at attention, felt his throat tighten. Just an hour ago, he'd been ready to escort the old man off base. Now, he realized he'd nearly turned away a living legend. As the salutes lowered, Admiral Brooks placed a hand on Hayes's shoulder. "Sir, where have you been all this time?" Hayes took a deep breath, his eyes clouding as the memories resurfaced. "After the storm, I drifted for 2 days on a piece of broken hull. A fishing vessel found me off the coast of Okinawa. I was half dead and half blind from salt. They took me to a small clinic, patched me up. By the time I made it home, they'd held my funeral. My wife had remarried. My son didn't recognize me. So I did what sailors do best. I went back to the sea." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the gathered men. No one dared speak. Even Carter, usually rigid and formal, found himself staring at the ground, ashamed of how he'd doubted the man's story. "You lived all these years," the Admiral said quietly, "and never told anyone?" Hayes shook his head. "What was there to tell? The Navy gave me everything. The sea took everything back. That's a fair trade in my book." From the edge of the dock, a few junior sailors whispered among themselves. "Is that really him? Can't be. He'd be older. Look at the way the Admiral's standing. That's respect. Damn. Imagine living long enough to see your own ship named after you." The whispers grew, soft but electric, passing from one sailor to another until everyone on the pier knew who the old man was. The name spread like wind across the deck. Captain Hayes, the lost commander of the Valor. Hayes turned his gaze toward the ship once more. The destroyer gleamed in the sunlight, her bow slicing through the reflection of the rising sun. He could see the freshly painted name on her side, USS Hayes, DDG-1215. He swallowed hard, emotion catching in his throat. She's a fine vessel, he said. She'll serve her crew well. Admiral Brooks followed his gaze. She already has, sir. The ship was named to honor your courage, your sacrifice. Every man who sails on her knows your story. The veteran chuckled softly. Then I pity them. My story isn't one of glory, Admiral. It's one of mistakes and mercy. A captain who couldn't save them all. Brooks shook his head. With all due respect, sir, the records say otherwise. You saved hundreds that night. You gave the order that kept the Valor's engine room sealed, even knowing it trapped you inside. You! Hayes lifted a trembling hand, cutting him off gently. The records tell the Navy's story. I live with the one the sea remembers. The Admiral fell silent. The wind picked up again, tugging at their uniforms. Nearby, Lieutenant Carter stood awkwardly, his face pale. Hayes noticed and turned toward him, offering a faint smile. You did your job, son. Don't look so haunted. A good officer protects his ship before he asks questions. Carter swallowed hard, then nodded. Yes, sir. I didn't know. How could you? Hayes said kindly. The Navy raises you to respect rules. But don't forget, sometimes rules bend when hearts don't. The young officer's eyes glistened, the weight of those words sinking deep. The Admiral looked over his shoulder at the cluster of sailors watching from the deck of the USS Hayes. Permission to come aboard, sir? He asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Hayes chuckled softly. I should be asking you that, Admiral. Brooks smiled for the first time. Not today, sir. As they spoke, a chief petty officer hurried down from the ship's gangway. He was a large man, with gray in his beard and medals on his chest. When he reached them, he stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes widening. Is that Captain Hayes? The Admiral nodded. The chief exhaled slowly. I'll be damned. My grandfather served under you, sir. He used to say you had ice water in your veins, that no man could steer through hell like you did. Hayes laughed softly. Your grandfather was too kind. I just had a good crew who trusted me. That's all a captain really has, the trust of his men. The chief stood straighter. If you'd like, sir, I could escort you aboard. I think the crew would like to meet the man behind the name. Before Hayes could answer, the Admiral interjected gently. Let's not rush him. It's been a long morning already. But Hayes's eyes never left the ship. The longing in them was unmistakable. I'd like that, he said finally, his voice soft but resolute. As they began to move toward the gangway, whispers spread even faster, no longer quiet, but alive with excitement. The real Captain Hayes. He's boarding the ship. No way. That's history walking right there. Lieutenant Carter followed a few steps behind, still trying to process the morning. He had started the day as an officer enforcing regulations, and now he was part of a story that would be told for generations. As the small group neared the base of the gangway, Hayes paused. He looked back at the crowd, dozens of sailors standing at attention, eyes locked on him. He raised his hand in a small salute. The sailors responded instantly, a wave of respect that rippled through the ranks. The air felt charged, sacred even. Admiral Brooks leaned closer. Sir, are you all right? Hayes nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. Just thinking, Admiral. It's strange to walk toward your own name. Brooks smiled sadly. It's not your name they honor, sir. It's what it stands for. Hayes looked back at the destroyer, her sleek lines and shining deck gleaming under the morning sun. Then let's make sure it still stands for the right things, he murmured. As he stepped onto the first rung of the gangway, the dock erupted into applause, not the loud, chaotic kind, but a deep, respectful rhythm that echoed across the harbor. For the sailors of the USS Hayes, the legend had come home. And for Captain William R. Hayes, the sea, his oldest companion, had finally returned something he thought he'd lost forever: belonging. The sound of boots against the metal gangway echoed like distant drumbeats. Every step Captain William R. Hayes took toward the deck of the USS Hayes felt like walking into a memory, one layered with salt, sorrow, and ghosts he thought he'd buried at sea. The Admiral walked beside him, silent, his expression a mix of reverence and concern. Behind them, Lieutenant Carter and a small honor guard followed in respectful formation. Above, sailors lined the rails, eyes wide, shoulders squared, the realization dawning that they were witnessing something they'd tell their grandchildren one day. When Hayes reached the deck, he paused. The steel beneath his boots vibrated faintly, the hum of engines, the heartbeat of a living ship. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. For a moment, it was 1957 again. He could smell the rain, hear the frantic shouts of his men on the Valor, the crash of waves smashing against the hull. He remembered the red glow of the emergency lights, the blare of alarms, and the cold sting of seawater as it poured through the cracks. "Captain?" Admiral Brooks's voice pulled him back to the present. Hayes opened his eyes, steadying himself. "She hums the same way," he said softly. "Every ship has her own rhythm, Admiral. Listen closely enough, and you can tell if she's proud or afraid." Brooks nodded, though his eyes lingered on the veteran with quiet worry. "You still speak like a captain." "I never stopped being one," Hayes replied, his gaze sweeping the deck. "Just didn't have a ship anymore." The Admiral gestured to the sailors. "Crew of the USS Hayes, stand at ease." The sailors relaxed slightly, but none of them could stop staring. Some grinned in awe. Others stood still, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. "This man," Brooks began, his voice carrying across the deck, "is the reason this ship bears its name." Captain William R. Hayes commanded the USS Valor, a destroyer lost in the Pacific during a typhoon. He was presumed dead. But as you can see, the sea gave him back to us. A ripple of murmurs swept through the ranks. Amazement, disbelief, admiration. Hayes raised a hand gently. "I didn't come here for honors, boys. I came to pay my respects. I've walked with the sea a long time, but she's never let me forget the faces of the men I lost." He looked toward the ship's bow, his eyes misting. "I hear them sometimes," he said quietly. "In the waves. In the wind." The words silenced everyone. Even the engines seemed to soften their hum. The Admiral stepped closer, speaking low enough that only Hayes could hear. "Sir, if it's too much." Hayes shook his head. "No, I need to do this." He motioned for Carter to follow. Together, they walked across the deck toward the memorial plaque, a bronze plate fixed near the ship's bridge. It bore the name USS Hayes, DDG 1215, followed by a short inscription, named in honor of Captain William R. Hayes, for valor beyond duty and sacrifice without measure. Beneath it were the names of every crewman lost on the USS Valor. Hayes stopped in front of it. His weathered fingers traced the first name, LT, Commander Paul T. Mason. His voice cracked. "He was my XO. Always said he'd follow me into hell if I asked. I told him to stay below deck and seal the engine room. He did. And he never came back." Lieutenant Carter swallowed hard. "Sir, those men, they would have drowned if he hadn't." Hayes nodded slowly. "I know, but he trusted me to get him home. That's a weight no metal can lift." Behind them, the crew stood motionless. The Admiral looked down, his own memories flickering, his younger self aboard the Valor, trembling in the storm, clinging to the railing as the ship broke apart. He remembered seeing Captain Hayes shouting over the roar of the waves, ordering them into lifeboats. He'd been the last man to jump before the sea swallowed the ship whole. "I remember that night," Brooks whispered. "You told me to go. I didn't want to leave you." Hayes smiled faintly. "And you disobeyed me twice. You turned back to pull out a wounded sailor. That's the kind of officer I wanted you to become." The Admiral blinked hard, emotion welling in his chest. "You saved us all, sir." Hayes looked up at him, the eyes of an old commander seeing not rank, but kinship. "No, son. We saved each other. The sea doesn't respect medals or rank. Only courage." They stood in silence for a long moment, the wind brushing through their hair. Then, Hayes turned to the young sailors watching. "Every ship you serve on will test you," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Storms will come, and fear will creep in. But remember this, ships don't sail because of steel. They sail because of hearts like yours. You are her true engines." His words seemed to sink deep into every sailor present. Some of them straightened unconsciously, inspired. Even Carter felt something shift inside him, the rigid sense of protocol giving way to something deeper, pride and purpose. The Admiral placed a hand on Hayes's shoulder. "Would you like to see the bridge, sir?" Hayes's eyes brightened faintly. If the old man still allowed on deck, I'd be honored. The crew parted like a living tide as they made their way inside. The interior gleamed with modern technology. Glass displays, digital charts, controls that looked more like a pilot's cockpit than the old brass dials Hayes remembered. He looked around, quietly impressed. "She's faster, sleeker, but she still smells like the sea." Lieutenant Carter smiled nervously. "We call her the Phantom, sir, because she's named after a ghost." Hayes chuckled softly. "A ghost, am I? Well, tell her I'm flattered." He moved toward the captain's chair, larger, more cushioned than the one he'd known, and placed a hand on it. "Funny thing," he said. "You spend half your life trying to earn this seat, and the other half wondering if you were ever worthy of it." Brooks watched silently as Hayes sank slowly into the chair. It fit him naturally, as though time had folded in on itself, and the Valor's captain had simply come home. "Feels the same," Hayes murmured, gripping the armrest. "Different ship. Same soul." For a moment, nobody spoke. The bridge hummed with quiet reverence. A few younger officers stood near the back, watching through misty eyes. It wasn't everyday history sat in the captain's chair. Finally, Admiral Brooks cleared his throat. "Captain Hayes, there's something you should know. The Navy never gave up searching for you. For years, your name stayed on our rolls as missing at sea. It wasn't until 1965 they changed it to presumed deceased. But the old-timers, they never stopped talking about you. You became a lesson, sir. The kind of story they tell every cadet at Annapolis." Hayes smiled faintly. "Stories are how the Navy remembers its ghosts. As long as they tell them, I'm not really gone." Brooks nodded, voice low. "You're not a ghost anymore, sir. You're living history." Hayes looked out through the bridge window, toward the endless blue horizon. "History has a short memory, Admiral. But the sea remembers everything." Silence followed, heavy but peaceful. After a long moment, Hayes rose from the chair. "Thank you for letting me aboard, Admiral. It means more than you know." Brooks saluted again. "The honor is ours, Captain." As Hayes made his way toward the exit, Carter called out softly, "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, why now? Why come back after all these years?" Hayes paused in the doorway, his profile framed by sunlight. "Because," he said, "I heard they were launching a new ship under my name, and I couldn't let her sail without her captain's blessing." He smiled, a small, weary but proud smile, then turned and stepped back into the daylight. Outside, the ocean stretched endlessly, shimmering in the sun. The waves whispered against the hull, as if welcoming him home. And for the first time in decades, Captain William R. Hayes felt at peace. The sun had begun to tilt westward when Captain Hayes stepped off the bridge. The air outside carried that familiar tang of salt and metal, the scent that had been his companion for most of his life. He paused by the rail, watching waves crash gently against the hull. Every movement of the water felt alive, almost personal, as if the ocean itself recognized the man it had once tried to claim. Behind him, Admiral Brooks lingered, quietly giving the old man space. The crew, though bustling with afternoon duties, kept glancing toward the weathered figure standing alone by the rail. They all knew they were in the presence of something rare, not just history, but living honor. Hayes took off his cap, running his fingers through his thinning gray hair. "The sea never changes," he murmured to no one in particular. "Only the men who face her do." A voice answered softly from behind. "Sir?" "If I may, that's something my grandfather used to say too." Hayes turned. A young petty officer stood there, barely in his mid-20s, with strikingly familiar blue eyes. His name tag read Mason. For a moment, Hayes's heart skipped a beat. "Mason?" he repeated quietly. "What did you say your grandfather's name was, son?" "Chief Engineer Paul Mason, sir," the young man replied proudly. "He served on the Valor, died during the typhoon. I grew up hearing stories about him, how he stayed below deck when everyone else evacuated. My dad told me he sealed the engine room to stop the flooding." Sighed Captain Hayes ordered it himself. The veteran's throat tightened. "Your grandfather," he whispered, his hand gripping the rail. "I owe him everything." Petty Officer Mason smiled. "Funny, my family always said he owed you everything. They called you a hero, sir. Syed, you made sure his sacrifice wasn't in vain?" Hayes turned away, his eyes misting as he stared at the horizon. "No, son," he said quietly. "If he hadn't done what he did, none of you would be standing here. Not me, not the Admiral. None of us." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The hum of the ship filled the silence, low and steady, like a heartbeat between generations. Then Hayes reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and tarnished. An old Navy insignia, the kind worn on an officer's collar during World War II. He turned it over in his palm before pressing it into Mason's hand. "He gave me this," Hayes said, "the night before the storm. Said it belonged to his father. Told me to return it if I made it back. I never did. Until now." Mason looked down at the insignia, his jaw tightening. His voice wavered when he spoke. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Hayes replied softly. "Just wear it with pride. You carry his name and his courage." The young sailor stood at attention, eyes shining. "Aye, sir." Behind them, Admiral Brooks watched quietly. He saw the way Hayes's hand lingered on Mason's shoulder, the kind of touch only a man haunted by loss could give. It wasn't just symbolic. It was closure. After a moment, Brooks stepped forward. "Captain, we've prepared something for you. If you'll follow me to the wardroom." Hayes nodded and followed him below deck, Mason walking alongside like a silent shadow. The wardroom was filled when they entered, officers and crew alike standing around a long table draped with the ship's ensign. On it rested a polished wooden box, the kind used for Navy memorials. Admiral Brooks gestured toward it. "Captain Hayes," he began, his voice firm but emotional. "The Navy keeps a few traditions alive, no matter how much time passes. This one's for the heroes who never came home." He lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded flag, the flag that had once draped the cenotaph of Captain William R. Hayes after he was declared lost at sea. Hayes stared at it, speechless. The years seemed to fall away from him in an instant. He reached out slowly, his hands trembling as they brushed the fabric. "You kept this?" he whispered. Brooks nodded. "We found it in archives at the Naval Museum in San Diego. When the USS Hayes was commissioned, I made sure they knew where it belonged." Hayes blinked rapidly, his vision blurring. "I don't deserve this." The Admiral's voice softened. "Sir, every man here disagrees." Around the table, the sailors nodded. Petty Officer Mason stepped forward, standing straight. "Sir, we wouldn't be here without men like you. You showed us what service really means." Hayes looked around the room, at faces young enough to be his great-grandsons, and for the first time in decades, he felt something warm stirring inside his chest, belonging, not to the past, but to the living heartbeat of the Navy that had carried on without him. He turned to Brooks. "Thank you, Admiral. You've given an old sailor more than he ever hoped for." But Brooks wasn't done. "There's more," he said, pulling out a folder. "The Department of the Navy has reinstated your record. You've been posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, and as of today, it's officially transferred to the living." "To you?" Hayes froze. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, he stepped forward as Brooks opened the case. The metal gleamed under the wardroom lights, a small piece of metal carrying the weight of everything he'd endured. "I've seen too many men get medals who didn't deserve them," Hayes said, his voice cracking. "And too many who deserved them and never got them. If I take this, it's for all of them, for the men on the Valor." Brooks nodded gravely. "Then it's right where it belongs." A quiet ripple of applause filled the room, not loud or ceremonial, but heartfelt. The kind that comes from respect too deep for words. Hayes stood still, his old eyes glistening as he looked at the medal in his palm. He could almost see his crew again. Mason, Alvarez, Jones, Peterson, standing behind him in the flickering light of the storm. For the first time, the memory didn't ache. It glowed. Later, as the sun set over the harbor, Hayes stood once more on the deck beside Petty Officer Mason. The young man held the insignia in one hand, the old flag in the other. They watched the light fade across the water, the horizon glowing gold and red. "Sir," Mason said quietly, "do you think the sea ever forgives?" Hayes thought for a long moment before answering. "The sea doesn't forgive or condemn. She just remembers. And if you love her enough, she might remember you kindly." Mason nodded, absorbing every word. "I hope so." "You will," Hayes said, clapping him gently on the back. "You've got your grandfather's eyes, and his courage. Just promise me one thing, son." "What's that, sir?" "When the storm comes, and it always comes, don't turn away from it. Face it head on. That's how you honor him." "And me?" Mason straightened. "Aye, sir." They stood in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon. The ship's flag rippled in the evening breeze, and the first stars appeared, small, steady lights above the endless sea. Captain Hayes closed his eyes. For the first time in decades, the sound of the waves didn't bring him pain. It brought him peace. The ghosts of the Valor were no longer lost at sea. They had come home, through him, through Mason, through every sailor who dared to face the storm. 2 days after the ceremony, the pier was alive again, not with whispers this time, but with celebration. Rows of sailors stood in perfect formation, their uniforms immaculate, their faces solemn. Families, journalists, and officials filled the stands. Banners fluttered in the October breeze, each one bearing the name USS Hayes, DDG 1215. At the center of it all, a podium stood draped in navy blue, with a single microphone gleaming in the sunlight. It was the day the Navy would officially honor Captain William R. Hayes, not as a ghost or a legend, but as a man who had returned home after half a century lost to the sea. Admiral Brooks stood beside the podium, reviewing the order of ceremony. "Sir," he said quietly, turning to Hayes, "I know speeches aren't exactly your favorite thing, but this one's yours. No script, no teleprompter. Just speak from the heart." Hayes smiled faintly. "That's the only way I ever knew how, Admiral." He was dressed in a crisp uniform the Navy had tailored for him the night before, a replica of his old captain's blues, medals gleaming freshly polished on his chest. For a moment, he looked decades younger, his shoulders squared, his gaze sharp and steady. The band struck up the Navy hymn as the crowd rose. The Admiral stepped forward first, delivering his speech. Short, respectful, filled with honor. He recounted the story of the valor, of bravery, of the storm that took so much, and yet somehow gave something back today. Then, as the applause settled, Admiral Brooks turned toward Hayes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice firm. "With pride, it is my privilege to introduce a man the sea could not keep. Captain William R. Hayes." The crowd erupted into applause, rising to their feet. Hayes stepped up slowly, gripping the podium. The noise faded until only the gentle hum of the ocean remained. He looked out at the faces, sailors, officers, families, reporters, and then back at the ship that bore his name. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried like thunder. "I've stood on a lot of decks in my life," he began. "Some calm, some trembling under the weight of waves higher than hope. But I've never stood on one quite like this." A ripple of soft laughter passed through the audience. "I was 28 when I first took command of the USS Valor," he continued. "I thought I knew everything a captain needed to know: navigation, discipline, strategy. What I didn't know was that the sea doesn't care about any of that. She doesn't listen to orders. She doesn't care about rank. She tests you, not just your strength, but your heart." He paused, letting the words breathe. "That night, when the storm came, I made choices that still visit me in my sleep. Choices that cost good men their lives. But I learned something in those waves. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing your duty even when fear is all you have left." In the front row, Petty Officer Mason listened, eyes glistening. Admiral Brooks stood at attention, jaw tight, every word hitting home. "I came here today," Hayes said, his voice softening, "not to be honored, but to honor them, the men who never came home. Their courage built the Navy you serve in now. Their names are carved in memory, not stone, and as long as ships sail and men stand watch, they'll never be forgotten." He glanced toward the USS Hayes gleaming under the sun. "They named this ship after me," he said with a faint, humble smile. "But I see it differently. This ship doesn't bear my name. It bears theirs. It carries every voice the sea tried to silence." The crowd was silent. Even the journalists had lowered their cameras. Hayes took a deep breath, his next words trembling slightly. "When I was found alive, I thought I had nothing left to come back to. My wife had remarried. My boy was gone. I thought I'd lost them forever. But standing here today, I see something I didn't expect to find again." He looked over. The crowd, at the sailors standing tall, the officers saluting, and finally at Petty Officer Mason, who stood in uniform at the end of the front row. "I see family," he said. Applause broke the silence, long, rolling, and sincere. Hayes nodded once, stepped back from the podium, and gave a final salute. The band began to play again. Cameras flashed. The Admiral came forward to clasp Hayes's hand. "You still have a way with words, Captain," Brooks said softly. Hayes chuckled. "I just said what the sea told me to." As the ceremony ended, people gathered to shake his hand. Sailors lined up to thank him, families took photos, and young cadets looked at him like he was something out of legend. Hayes accepted it all with quiet grace, but in the midst of the crowd, something caught his attention. A woman, standing a little apart, her hands clasped, her expression unreadable. She was in her late 50s, with gray-streaked hair and eyes that mirrored his own. When their eyes met, the world seemed to fall away. She stepped forward hesitantly. "Captain Hayes?" He frowned slightly, searching her face. "Yes, ma'am?" The woman's eyes shimmered with tears. "You wouldn't remember me," she said softly. "I was 2 years old when the Navy told us you were gone." For a heartbeat, Hayes couldn't move. His voice dropped to a whisper. What did you just say?" "My mother's name was Margaret," she continued, her voice breaking. "Margaret Hayes, you're my father." The words hit him like a wave. The air left his lungs. Brooks froze beside him, realization dawning. "My God," he murmured. Hayes reached out, trembling, his hand hovering in the air. You can't be—" She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I spent my whole life thinking you died in that storm. Mom never stopped talking about you. She said you were the bravest man she'd ever known." For a long, breathless moment, the crowd around them vanished. It was just the two of them. A father and daughter separated by decades, reunited under the flag of the nation he'd served. Hayes finally found his voice, soft and fragile. "I tried to come home," he said. "I did, but when I saw she'd moved on, I couldn't take that from her. I thought it was better that way." His daughter shook her head. "We would have wanted you. I would have wanted you." He took a step closer, tears in his own eyes. "And I would have given anything to see you grow up." They embraced, tightly, fiercely, the years between them dissolving in an instant. The crowd around them, sensing the weight of the moment, stayed silent. Even the band had stopped playing. When they finally pulled apart, she smiled through her tears. "You have a grandson," she said. "He's in the Navy, too. I think you met him already? Petty Officer Mason." Hayes froze again, the world spinning as understanding struck him like lightning. He turned toward Mason, who stood just yards away, stunned. "Mason," he whispered. "Your father, My father," Mason said slowly, his voice trembling, "was your daughter's husband?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then, the old captain's knees nearly buckled. "You're my grandson?" Mason nodded, eyes wet. "Yes, sir. I guess the sea didn't just give you back to the Navy. She gave you back to us." Hayes's breath caught. He stepped forward and pulled Mason into his arms, holding him the way he once held the men he'd saved. The way a grandfather holds the last piece of the life he thought was lost forever. Tears welled in Admiral Brooks's eyes. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered to himself. The sea truly does have a memory. The three of them, Hayes, his daughter, and Mason, stood together as the ship's bell tolled in the distance. The Admiral looked up at the clear blue sky, then at the flags snapping in the wind above them. And somewhere deep inside, even the ocean seemed to calm, as though the waves themselves understood that the man they'd once claimed had finally found his way home. The sun was sinking low over Norfolk Harbor, staining the sky in deep gold and amber. The waves shimmered beneath the dying light, rocking the docked USS Hayes gently against its moorings. Captain William Hayes stood at the edge of the deck, the wind tugging softly at his uniform. Behind him, the ship buzzed with quiet life, sailors performing their evening checks, the faint hum of machinery, the occasional laugh echoing from below deck. But Hayes wasn't watching the sailors or the horizon. He was watching time itself, the endless horizon that had taken most of his life, and at long last brought him back. Footsteps approached behind him. "Permission to come aboard, sir?" Hayes turned and smiled faintly. "You're already on board, Petty Officer." Mason grinned, scratching the back of his neck. "Guess I'm still getting used to calling you Grandpa, sir." Hayes chuckled softly, turning back toward the ocean. "Takes time." The sea doesn't reveal her secrets all at once. Neither does life. They stood side by side, silent for a moment, watching the sun dip below the waves. Mason finally spoke again, his tone quieter. "You really built this ship, didn't you?" Hayes nodded slowly. "In a way, yes. Not with these hands, but with the lessons of the men who came before me. Every ship carries ghosts, Mason. Some you learn from. Some you carry forever." The younger man looked at him carefully. "Do you still see them? The crew from the Valor?" Hayes smiled wistfully. "Every time the wind changes." A pause lingered between them, filled with the sound of the ocean brushing against the hull. Then, from behind, Admiral Brooks's voice broke the silence. "Evening, Captain. I thought I'd find you here." Hayes turned, greeting him with a firm handshake. "Evening, Admiral. Can't seem to leave her just yet." Brooks nodded. "I know the feeling. When I was a young ensign, I thought I'd walk away from the Navy one day. Then I realized it never really lets you go." He looked between Hayes and Mason, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You too have something special here. 3 generations of sailors. That's something even the sea can't wash away." Hayes gestured toward the open deck. "Join us for a moment?" Brooks stepped up beside them, the 3 men facing the darkening horizon together. The ship was quiet now, most of the crew below deck, preparing for the night. Hayes took a deep breath, the salt air filling his lungs. "You know, Admiral, I used to believe that a man's worth was measured by the ships he commanded, or the medals on his chest. But standing here now, I realize it's something else entirely." Brooks glanced at him. "And what's that, Captain?" "The lives he's touched. The people who remember him." He turned to Mason. "The legacy he leaves behind." Mason swallowed hard. "You've already done that, Grandpa. You gave everything for this country, for your men." Hayes shook his head gently. "That's not what I mean, son. Service isn't about what you give up. It's about what you give forward." The Admiral nodded slowly. Spoken like a true sailor. The 3 men stood in silence for a while longer, the last light of the sun disappearing beneath the waves. Then Hayes spoke again, his tone quiet and reflective. "When I was lost at sea, I kept thinking about one thing. Not death, not fear, but the sound of my daughter's laughter, the smell of coffee in the kitchen, the small things we never think to hold on to until they're gone." He looked down at Mason, eyes glistening. "Don't ever take those things for granted. The ocean can take a man's body, but not his memories. Not his love." Mason's voice cracked. "I won't forget, Grandpa." Hayes smiled and put a hand on his shoulder. "Good, because the day you forget what matters, that's the day you stop being a sailor." Brooks cleared his throat softly, emotion thick in his voice. "Captain, there's something you should know. Command's considering naming a new leadership program after you. For veterans returning from service, men who feel they've lost their place in the world." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "I didn't think they named programs after ghosts." Brooks smiled faintly. "Not ghosts, legends." Hayes chuckled. "Well, if it helps someone find their way home a little faster than I did, then maybe that storm was worth it." The Admiral checked his watch and sighed. "I'll leave you 2 alone. The ship's yours for the night, Captain." He gave one last salute before heading down the gangway, leaving Hayes and Mason alone beneath the stars. The night deepened, wrapping the ship in calm. The sound of the ocean blended with the creak of the ropes and the distant hum of the port. Hayes looked up at the constellations overhead, old friends from countless watches at sea. "Do you know the first lesson I ever learned as a captain?" he asked. Mason shook his head. "That no matter how vast the ocean seems, every ship sails toward something. A home, a promise, a memory. It's when you forget why you're sailing that you get lost." He handed Mason a small, worn compass from his pocket, its brass edges dulled by time, its needle trembling faintly. "This guided me through the Pacific," Hayes said quietly. "Through storms, battles, and nights darker than sin. But it's not the compass that matters. It's the hand that holds it steady." Mason stared at the object, overwhelmed. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can," Hayes interrupted gently. "It's yours now." Every captain passes down something. A story, a lesson, a promise. This one's mine to you. Mason swallowed hard, clutching the compass. "I'll keep it safe." "I know you will." For a long while, neither of them spoke. The stars shimmered above, like lanterns of memory. Then Hayes said softly, "I think it's time I turned in." Mason nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Want me to walk you down, sir?" Hayes smiled faintly. "No need, sailor. I know my way around a ship." He began to walk toward his cabin. Slowly, every step measured, his silhouette framed by moonlight. Mason watched him go, the ache of goodbye tightening in his chest. Halfway down the deck, Hayes paused and turned. "You've made me proud, Mason. Don't ever doubt that." Mason's voice broke. "I, sir?" Hayes smiled one last time, then disappeared into the ship's interior. Hours later, the first hint of dawn touched the water. Mason woke suddenly, sensing something. He rushed to his grandfather's quarters, the door slightly ajar. Inside, Hayes sat in his chair by the porthole, uniform immaculate, hands folded in his lap. His eyes were closed, his expression peaceful, as though he were merely listening to the sea one last time. The rising sun bathed the room in gold. Mason stepped closer, his throat tightening. On the desk beside Hayes lay a note, written in steady, precise handwriting. "The sea took nothing from me that it did not one day return. I am home now, in every wave, every wind, every sailor who remembers what duty means. Keep the watch. Captain William R. Hayes." Mason stood there for a long time, silent, as tears rolled down his cheeks. Then, slowly, he raised his hand to his brow and gave one final salute. Outside, the ocean gleamed, calm, endless, alive. The USS Hayes creaked gently in the morning breeze, her flag fluttering high. Somewhere deep beneath those waves, the spirits of the Valor seemed to stir. Their watch finally ended. And as the sun rose over Norfolk, one thing became certain. The story of Captain Hayes would sail on forever. The morning fog hung low over Norfolk Harbor, soft and silver, curling like smoke above the deck of the USS Hayes. Sailors moved quietly, performing their duties with precision, but the usual clatter and chatter felt subdued. Today was not an ordinary day. It was the day the Navy and the crew would honor a legend, and the man who had become one. Petty Officer Mason stood at the bow, the old compass Hayes had given him in hand. He ran his fingers over its brass casing, feeling the weight of generations, the stories, the courage, and the sacrifices of men he'd only begun to understand. He looked out toward the horizon and whispered, "Grandpa, I'll make sure everyone remembers." Below deck, preparations were underway for a formal tribute. Admiral Brooks had coordinated the ceremony personally, ensuring every detail reflected the honor due to the man who had returned from the sea and reshaped their navy. Flags were arranged in perfect symmetry. Sailors polished brass rails until they gleamed. The band rehearsed their pieces, notes echoing faintly through the fog. Mason lingered by the rail, recalling the moments from the past week, the first sighting of Captain Hayes on the pier, the handover of the insignia, the tearful embrace with his long-lost daughter. Every event seemed magnified now, each memory a lantern lighting the way to understanding the depth of courage and sacrifice. The Admiral appeared at his side. "You've done well, Mason," Brooks said quietly. Your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become. Mason glanced at him, voice heavy. I just hope I can carry forward what he taught me, without losing the man he was. Brooks smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting the morning haze. The best sailors don't forget. They pass it along. The ceremony began just after 9. A hush fell over the harbor as the Navy hymn played softly. Families and guests lined the pier. The crew of the USS Hayes stood at attention. The Admiral stepped forward, raising a hand to signal silence. Today, Brooks began, voice carrying across the harbor, we honor a man who has defined courage, sacrifice, and duty for generations. Captain William R. Hayes, once declared lost at sea, has returned to remind us that heroism is not measured solely in battles fought, but in lives touched, lessons passed, and legacies continued. Mason's chest tightened. He felt a pull in his heart, a connection that bridged the years of absence, loss, and finally return. Brooks continued, recounting Hayes's service aboard the USS Valor, the storm that nearly claimed him, and the decades he spent at sea before finally coming home. Every word was met with respectful nods, murmurs of awe, and occasional sniffles from the assembled families. Then, Brooks gestured toward Mason. It is my honor to hand the stage over to Captain Hayes's grandson, a man who carries forward his courage, his teachings, and his heart. Mason stepped forward, clutching the compass. His gaze swept the crowd, but he found the eyes of Hayes's daughter first. She gave him a small nod, encouraging him. Then he faced the crew and the gathered officers. He began, voice steady, though tinged with emotion. My grandfather, Captain William R. Hayes, taught me that the sea is never an enemy. It's a teacher. It challenges us, breaks us, and sometimes takes from us what we hold dear. But it also gives back, if we remember, if we honor, if we lead with courage. The compass gleamed in the morning sun. Mason held it high, a symbol of continuity. I carry this now, not just as a keepsake, but as a promise. A promise that the lessons, the sacrifices, and the legacy of Captain Hayes will never be forgotten. That his story will guide us when we face storms, literal or metaphorical, just as he guided the Valor and the generations of sailors who followed. A hush followed, the kind that presses against the heart. Sailors felt it. Families felt it. Even the fog seemed to pause in reverence. Then Mason stepped back, saluting sharply. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing across the water like cannon fire, not violent, but celebratory, honoring the man and his enduring impact. After the ceremony, Hayes's daughter approached Mason and wrapped her arms around him. He would have been so proud, she whispered. I know, Mom, Mason replied, tears welling. And I feel like I can hear him still guiding me. At the same moment, the Admiral walked over. Mason, Brooks said softly, your grandfather left more than a ship or a medal. He left a compass for all of us, for the Navy itself. Today, you've honored him in a way even he would have been humbled by. Mason nodded. I just hope I can keep living up to it. Brooks placed a hand on his shoulder. You already are. The USS Hayes itself seemed to respond. Its deck gleamed, flags snapped in the breeze, and the engines hummed quietly, as though the ship recognized its namesake's final wish, that his story be remembered, carried forward, and never forgotten. Weeks later, Mason walked the deck alone in the early morning light. The fog rolled in again, soft and silver, curling over the rails like a gentle reminder of the past. He paused at the rail, staring down at the ocean that had taken so much, but also given back. He placed the old compass in the deck's shadow, looking out at the horizon. Grandpa, he whispered, I'll keep the watch. I promise. A cool breeze touched his face, carrying the faint scent of salt and seaweed. Mason imagined the old man standing beside him, steady and calm, his eyes reflecting the infinite horizon. He smiled softly. The sea remembers, doesn't she? And somewhere deep within the waves, it seems she did. The USS Hayes slid through the water with effortless grace, her hull cutting through the waves as if carrying the memory of every soul who had ever sailed her namesake. For the sailors aboard, every lesson of courage, loyalty, and honor was no longer abstract. It was alive, present, and tangible in their hands, hearts, and minds. Mason turned to the deck, where younger sailors were preparing for training exercises. He nodded to them, silently conveying the unspoken truth. The legacy of Captain William R. Hayes would live in them, guiding their decisions, shaping their courage, and reminding them of the human cost of service. For the first time in decades, the sea seemed at peace. Captain William R. Hayes, though gone, had returned in every way that mattered, through Mason, through his daughter, through the ship that bore his name, and through the countless sailors who would continue to sail into storms, knowing the lessons he had left behind. And as the sun rose higher, glittering across the waves, the USS Hayes cut through the harbor with purpose, carrying not just a ship or a crew, but the living, enduring spirit of a man who had defied the ocean, returned home, and ensured that no story, no sacrifice, would ever be forgotten. The story of Captain Hayes, lost, found, and immortal, would sail forever, etched not just in steel, medals, and history books, but in the hearts of those who carried his courage forward. And somewhere, on the horizon where sky met water, the sea seemed to whisper a soft, eternal promise. The watch will continue.